You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Constructive dissent is the disciplined practice of challenging prevailing assumptions, decisions, or norms in ways that improve outcomes rather than simply disrupt progress. It is not about arguing for the sake of argument, nor is it about obstructionism that slows momentum without offering alternatives. Instead, constructive dissent channels principled challenge into exploration of blind spots, surfacing of risks, and testing of assumptions. The distinction matters because unmanaged dissent can derail trust and cohesion, while suppressed dissent leads to groupthink and costly oversights. A healthy team culture encourages disagreement when it is grounded in evidence and framed respectfully, treating it as a contribution rather than a threat. Think of dissent as a safety valve in a system. Without it, pressure builds until failure occurs. With it, the system can adapt and continue safely. Constructive dissent ensures adaptability while protecting integrity. A speak-up climate depends on explicit commitments from leadership and peers that dissent will be heard respectfully and never punished. These commitments form a psychological contract where individuals trust that raising concerns will not jeopardize their role, reputation, or relationships. For example, a leader might explicitly state, "I expect you to tell me if you see risks in this plan, and I will thank you for doing so." This explicit guarantee counters the natural fear of reprisal that often silences employees. Without such assurances, people withhold vital insights, allowing problems to fester. On the exam, speak-up scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between rhetorical encouragement and genuine commitments. The agile response usually emphasizes that climate is shaped not just by words but by consistent actions that reward candor and protect dissenters. The value case for dissent links it directly to risk reduction, innovation, and ethical safeguards. Dissent prevents blind spots from turning into costly defects or public failures by catching risks early. For example, an engineer questioning an aggressive deployment schedule may prevent outages that harm customer trust. Dissent also fuels innovation by inviting diverse ideas, challenging complacency, and opening space for alternatives that may be superior. Finally, dissent acts as an ethical guardrail, enabling individuals to voice concerns about safety, compliance, or fairness before harm occurs. Consider the well-documented failures in industries where dissent was discouraged. Disasters often follow silence. On the exam, value case scenarios often test whether candidates understand dissent as both a defensive and generative tool. The agile response usually emphasizes that challenge is not a distraction, but an essential mechanism for quality and responsibility. Cognitive diversity makes dissent more powerful by broadening the pool of perspectives. Teams with varied backgrounds, experiences, and ways of thinking are less likely to share the same blind spots. When everyone approaches a problem similarly, correlated errors multiply and dissent dwindles. By contrast, when a team includes a mix of roles, disciplines, and cultural perspectives, dissent is more likely to reveal overlooked constraints or new opportunities. For instance, a finance expert might question assumptions in a product plan that engineers or marketers overlook, preventing costly surprises. Diversity also increases the resilience of decisions because they are tested against more variables. On the exam, diversity scenarios often test whether candidates can link inclusion to dissent quality. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent thrives when different voices are present and welcomed, expanding the horizon of possible insights. Pre-mortem practice institutionalizes dissent by asking teams to imagine that a decision or project has failed and to list plausible causes. This exercise legitimizes concerns that might otherwise remain unspoken, converting latent unease into explicit risks with owners and mitigations. For example, a team planning a migration might list underestimating integration complexity as a failure cause, prompting proactive mitigation. Pre-mortems remove stigma from dissent because everyone participates and all concerns are treated as valuable inputs. The practice reframes negativity as foresight, embedding constructive dissent directly into decision processes. On the exam, pre-mortem scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize mechanisms that surface risk proactively. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent does not have to wait for courage. It can be structured into routine processes that make challenge safe and expected. Structured challenge roles further reduce personal risk by separating critique from personal identity. Assigning roles such as devil's advocate or red team designates someone to test assumptions, ensuring critical scrutiny without personalizing disagreement. For instance, a red team might be tasked with finding vulnerabilities in a proposed design, while the core team defends its logic. Because the role is assigned, critique is expected and depersonalized, preventing defensive escalation. This structured dissent improves resilience by exposing weaknesses while protecting relationships. Without such roles, dissent often depends on individuals taking personal risks, which discourages candor. On the exam, challenge role scenarios often test whether candidates can identify tools for depersonalizing dissent. The agile response usually emphasizes that structures can normalize critique, turning what feels risky into an accepted responsibility. Early challenge windows build dissent into the timeline of decisions, allocating time to generate alternatives and test criteria before final convergence prevents the common problem where dissent emerges only after commitments are made, making challenge costly. For example, in a planning session, dedicating the first half hour to exploring alternatives ensures ideas are surfaced before momentum hardens. This reduces the perception that dissent is obstruction, reframing it as part of the decision process. Without early windows, people may stay silent until late, when raising objections feels like sabotage. On the exam, early window scenarios often test whether candidates can link timing to dissent effectiveness. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent is most useful upstream, where change is cheap and options are still open. Evidence standards ensure that dissent remains constructive rather than emotional, requiring dissenters to articulate claims, identify assumptions, and propose tests keeps dialogue grounded. For example, instead of saying, "This will never work," a dissenter might say, "This plan assumes 20% customer adoption in 3 months. Can we test that assumption with a pilot?" Such framing makes dissent falsifiable and actionable, preventing it from degenerating into obstruction. Evidence standards also set fairness expectations. All views, not just dissent, must be supported by reasoning and data. On the exam, evidence standard scenarios often test whether candidates can differentiate between constructive critique and unsupported complaint. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent should invite testing, not merely delay decisions. This discipline makes challenge a source of progress rather than friction. Escalation pathways clarify when and how to raise unresolved concerns. If a team cannot resolve a disagreement locally, a defined process ensures dissent can be elevated without fear or stigma. For example, a technical team might escalate unresolved security concerns to a governance board with broader authority. This prevents stalemate while preserving psychological safety. Without escalation, dissent either festers unresolved or is suppressed, both of which undermine reliability. On the exam, escalation scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between healthy persistence and obstruction. The agile response usually emphasizes that escalation is not defiance, it is part of accountability. Safe pathways allow dissent to scale responsibly, ensuring risks are not buried when local authority is insufficient. Non-retaliation and fairness policies reinforce that disagreement is valued as contribution. Policies might include clear statements that retaliation for raising concerns will be investigated and sanctioned, alongside expectations that dissent must be respectful and evidence-based. For example, a company might protect employees who raise safety concerns under whistleblower policies. Fairness policies also ensure that dissent is weighed based on merit, not hierarchy. Without such protections, promises of openness ring hollow, and silence returns. On the exam, policy scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize the structural safeguards needed for safety. The agile response usually emphasizes that culture is anchored in both behavior and rules. Non-retaliation commitments give dissenters confidence that challenge will not cost them their credibility, careers, or relationships. Facilitation support makes sure dissenting voices are not drowned out by status or communication style. Skilled facilitators distribute airtime, reframe heated exchanges, and ensure that warranted objections are considered fully. For example, in a meeting dominated by senior voices, a facilitator might pause and invite contributions from junior members before proceeding. Without facilitation, dissent often depends on interpersonal assertiveness, which disadvantages quieter or less powerful participants. On the exam, facilitation scenarios often test whether candidates can connect process design to dissent inclusion. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent requires not just permission, but protection. Facilitation ensures equity of contribution, making constructive dissent a function of structure, not just personality. Documenting options and trade-offs creates accountability by recording alternatives considered and why a particular path was chosen. This documentation allows future teams to understand that dissent was heard and weighed, even if not adopted. For example, a decision record might state, Option B was rejected due to cost constraints but revisited if conditions change. This transparency reassures dissenters that their contributions mattered and provides a basis for learning if outcomes disappoint. Without documentation, dissent can feel ignored, and organizations risk repeating past mistakes. On the exam, documentation scenarios often test whether candidates can identify how transparency reinforces dissent culture. The agile response usually emphasizes that recording deliberation preserves both accountability and institutional memory, turning dissent into lasting value rather than ephemeral debate. Debiasing habits protect evaluation from distortion when pressure mounts. Anchoring, where the first proposal dominates, or sunk cost fallacies, where past investment biases judgment, often stifle dissent. Teams that deliberately seek disconfirming evidence, question assumptions, and test against fresh data counter these tendencies. For example, asking, "What evidence would convince us this plan is wrong?" creates space for challenge. Debiasing turns dissent into disciplined exploration rather than emotional objection. On the exam, bias scenarios often test whether candidates can identify how cognitive habits affect dissent. The agile response usually emphasizes that challenge requires both courage and technique. Debiasing makes dissent safer by embedding critical thinking into routine evaluation. It ensures teams remain grounded in evidence even under pressure. Distributed dissent channels make sure remote participants have equal opportunity to challenge. Asynchronous written mechanisms, such as comment threads on pre-reads or digital forms for raising concerns, allow reflection without interruption barriers. For example, a remote team member who hesitates to interrupt a meeting might post objections in advance, ensuring their view is considered. Without such channels, dissent privileges those physically present or more assertive, silencing valuable perspectives. On the exam, remote safety scenarios often test whether candidates can adapt dissent practices to distributed contexts. The agile response usually emphasizes inclusivity across geography and style. Distributed dissent channels expand equity by ensuring every participant, regardless of location or confidence, can contribute to challenge. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Dissent rituals provide teams with standardized spaces to challenge assumptions without relying on individual courage alone. Risk reviews, decision pre-reads, and assumption checks create predictable forums where concerns are expected and structured. For example, before finalizing a release plan, a risk review might explicitly ask each participant to surface potential points of failure. This normalizes dissent as part of process rather than as an act of personal defiance. Rituals also reduce the emotional cost of speaking up, since everyone is invited to contribute in turn. Without such mechanisms, dissent is sporadic, surfacing only when individuals feel brave enough to interrupt momentum. On the exam, dissent ritual scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize structures that democratize challenge. The agile response usually emphasizes that making dissent routine embeds it into culture, ensuring critical insights are captured reliably rather than by chance. Structured debates channel disagreement productively by bracketing it with clear goals, time limits, and synthesis steps. Rather than letting discussions spiral, structured debates clarify the question, invite arguments for each side, and then guide participants toward shared criteria or testable hypotheses. For example, instead of endless argument over which framework to adopt, a structured debate might allocate 15 minutes for each perspective, followed by 10 minutes to synthesize common ground. This prevents debates from devolving into personal battles while still surfacing valuable perspectives. Without structure, debates often reward the loudest voices rather than the best ideas. On the exam, structured debate scenarios often test whether candidates can differentiate between unbounded conflict and facilitated challenge. The agile response usually emphasizes that structure allows dissent to sharpen decisions rather than fragment relationships. Post-decision norms balance unity with vigilance by combining disagree and commit with monitoring plans. Once a decision is made, dissenters agree to support execution fully, preventing paralysis. At the same time, monitoring plans specify what signals would justify revisiting the choice. For example, after choosing a vendor, the team might agree to commit to the partnership while monitoring performance metrics closely. If thresholds are missed, escalation is automatic. This approach honors dissent while preserving discipline. Without it, organizations risk either endless relitigation or blind loyalty to flawed paths. On the exam, post-decision scenarios often test whether candidates can link dissent to execution discipline. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent does not end with decision. It evolves into collective commitment tempered by evidence. Health indicators measure whether dissent culture is functioning effectively. Indicators might include the number and quality of alternatives considered, the time it takes for critical risks to surface, and the frequency of constructive reversals when better evidence emerges. For example, if decisions consistently involve only one option, it suggests dissent is absent. If reversals never occur, it may mean dissent signals are ignored. Conversely, healthy systems show both alternatives and occasional reversals, reflecting adaptability. Without indicators, dissent culture risks drifting into rhetoric without results. On the exam, health indicator scenarios often test whether candidates can connect dissent to measurable outcomes. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent must be visible not just in words but in system performance. Healthy dissent shortens time to learning and improves decision resilience. Learning from misses reinforces the value of dissent by analyzing decisions where concerns were absent or ignored. Teams examine what signals should have been raised, why they were not, and how forums or guardrails can be improved. For example, a project that failed due to underestimated dependencies might reveal that team members noticed risks but felt unsafe to speak. By studying misses, organizations refine processes, leadership behaviors, or escalation paths. Without this analysis, silence remains invisible and repeats. On the exam, misanalysis scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize the importance of reflecting on absent dissent. The agile response usually emphasizes that learning includes studying what was not said. Improvement depends on closing the gap between potential insight and actual voice. Leadership invitations are one of the most powerful signals that dissent is safe. Leaders who explicitly request challenge, "What am I not seeing?" and then show visible gratitude for contributions demonstrate that dissent is valued, not tolerated. This modeling counters the strong human tendency to defer to authority. For example, a leader who thanks a junior engineer for raising a risk sets a tone that dissent is not only allowed but rewarded, without visible invitations. Rhetorical claims of openness often ring hollow. On the exam, leadership invitation scenarios often test whether candidates can link behavior to climate. The agile response usually emphasizes that safety is proven in actions, not slogans. Leaders must create space for dissent actively, showing appreciation even when it complicates decisions. Meeting designs can support dissent by reducing dominance effects. Structured rounds, written first responses, and rotating facilitators prevent discussions from being controlled by senior or extroverted voices. For example, a meeting might begin with each participant submitting written input before open discussion. This ensures all perspectives are considered equally before momentum forms. Rotating facilitation also prevents any one voice from framing issues repeatedly. Without such designs, dissent is skewed toward the powerful or confident, silencing others. On the exam, meeting design scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize how process protects inclusion. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent must be engineered into conversation formats, ensuring fairness and breadth of contribution. Seniority effect mitigation separates reputation from idea quality. Anonymous input methods, such as pre-submitted comments, allow ideas to be evaluated on merit rather than on who proposed them. Ahead-of-time written positions can also reduce the influence of live hierarchy. For example, a senior architect and a junior developer might both submit written proposals, considered without attribution, ensuring fairness. This practice prevents automatic deference to rank and allows dissent from less powerful participants to surface. Without mitigation, valuable perspectives are lost because people assume senior voices cannot be challenged. On the exam, seniority effect scenarios often test whether candidates can identify practices that decouple authority from insight. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent culture depends on equal weight to all reasoned input, regardless of source. Toxic dissent boundaries clarify that not all challenge is constructive. Evidence-based critique is welcomed, but ad hominem attacks, obstruction without alternatives, or sarcasm that undermines trust cross into toxicity. For example, questioning an idea's assumptions is constructive, while attacking a colleague personally is not. Boundaries ensure that safety is preserved for good faith dissent, while consequences exist for destructive behavior. Without boundaries, toxic patterns masquerade as candor, eroding trust and discouraging others from speaking. On the exam, toxic dissent scenarios often test whether candidates can separate helpful challenge from harmful conduct. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent must be principled and disciplined. Boundaries protect the system, ensuring that critique sharpens ideas without damaging people. Recognition practices reinforce dissent culture by crediting those whose challenge prevented harm or improved outcomes. Publicly acknowledging contributors shows that dissent has real value and encourages repetition. For example, celebrating a team member who flagged a regulatory risk that saved millions in fines demonstrates that speaking up is rewarded. Recognition shifts dissent from an act of courage to a normal expectation. Without reinforcement, dissent feels risky and fades over time. On the exam, recognition scenarios often test whether candidates can link cultural reinforcement to sustained behavior. The agile response usually emphasizes that culture is shaped not only by structures but also by celebration. Recognition multiplies safety by showing that dissent makes heroes, not troublemakers. Integration with risk management ensures that dissent outputs are not lost but translated into action. Concerns raised should flow into risk registers, experiments, or backlog items, ensuring accountability. For example, if dissenters question performance assumptions, a test item might be added to the backlog. Without integration, dissent becomes empty discussion, with no follow-through. Over time, this discourages candor, as people feel their objections vanish. On the exam, integration scenarios often test whether candidates can connect dissent to managed outcomes. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent must lead to measurable actions. Risk registers and backlog entries ensure objections are respected and tracked, turning words into managed work. Vendor and partner channels extend dissent practices across organizational boundaries. In joint projects, safe challenge is critical because misaligned incentives often discourage candor. Establishing forums where partners can raise risks early prevents late surprises. For example, a vendor warning about unrealistic integration timelines must be welcomed, not penalized. Without external channels, dissent is suppressed and projects fail. On the exam, vendor scenarios often test whether candidates can expand culture externally. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent must apply across all contributors. Building channels with vendors and partners ensures reliability across ecosystems, not just internally. Ethical escalation routes provide protected pathways for raising legal, safety, or compliance concerns when ordinary forums are insufficient. For example, whistleblower lines or ombuds offices allow individuals to raise critical issues without fear of conflict of interest. These routes preserve organizational integrity, ensuring dissent protects not just outcomes but also ethics. Without them, employees may feel trapped, unable to surface unacceptable risks safely. On the exam, escalation scenarios often test whether candidates can identify systemic protections. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent includes responsibility for ethics. Protected escalation routes guarantee that even sensitive or unpopular truths can be voiced, preserving integrity at scale. Sustainment plans keep dissent cultures alive as leadership and context change. Training, refreshers, and periodic audits of retaliation risk ensure that commitments remain real rather than rhetorical. For example, annual reviews might examine whether dissenters experienced career setbacks, correcting systems where retaliation persists. Without sustainment, even well-designed cultures decay, especially under new pressures. On the exam, sustainment scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize the fragility of dissent culture. The agile response usually emphasizes that dissent requires constant reinforcement. Like security or safety, it is never done. Sustainment ensures dissent remains durable, protecting organizations from the complacency that silence breeds. In conclusion, constructive dissent is the disciplined ability to challenge wisely, decide well, and execute with integrity. It thrives on safety commitments, structured challenge, and evidence standards that keep dialogue principled. Rituals and roles normalize dissent, while leadership invitations and recognition reinforce its value. Healthy dissent integrates with risk management and extends across vendors, partners, and ethical boundaries, ensuring reliability in complex systems. Boundaries protect against toxic behavior, and sustainment keeps the culture durable. On the exam, candidates will be tested on whether they can recognize practices that encourage safe challenge. In practice, dissent is not disruption. It is the safeguard against groupthink and the spark of innovation, ensuring organizations adapt with resilience and act with integrity. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.